I read about some really interesting research that was published in 2019, and I think it's a really interesting conversation starter because it's all about not starting conversations. Let me explain. So the research discovered that people were more afraid, they had more fear about asking difficult questions or bringing up sensitive topics to other people more than the fear they had around being asked difficult or sensitive questions. Isn't that interesting? I feel like I've seen this pattern before in other people. Like, don't you have friends who say, "Oh, I'm an open book, you can ask me anything. I'm totally cool with talking about whatever." And maybe that shows their comfort with people asking them things, right? Seems pretty real. But when it comes to asking other people difficult or sensitive questions, we're a little afraid. And I think this has a lot to do with perceived risk. And I don't think it's accurate, and I'll get to why. So the perceived risk of asking someone else a difficult or sensitive question or bringing up a sticky topic or a little taboo topic, especially if it's around sexuality, right, is that we're afraid of their reaction and maybe how they'll judge us or reject us. And like I've been talking about lately, so much is rooted in rejection. It's kind of like this underlying thing that's all around us in our lives. So when we're afraid to offend someone else or afraid to get too personal or put them off a little and make them ask like, "Why did you bring this up? Like, what are you talking about? Like, ooh, TMI." And we may get those reactions sometimes. And of course that says more about the other person and the feelings they're going through at the time, more than it does about us and what we want to bring up or say about ourselves, our like authentic expression, right? So the perceived risk of sharing something about yourself if you are asked a difficult or sensitive or taboo question, like let's say someone asks you about your sex life. If you don't want to talk about it, you can always change the subject, divert the topic a little, make a joke, laugh it off, something like that, or tell them a white lie, who knows. And so the risk is very low there. We have skills that help protect us when we feel like, ooh, that was a little too sensitive. But when we ask others a question or broach a topic that's a little taboo, there's not a lot of protection in place where it's like we just sort of put it out there into the conversation and we don't know how they're going to react. We don't know where this is going to go. We don't know what they're going to think of us. And so the perceived risk is higher. So people are afraid that like they falsely believe that others don't want to talk about certain topics. And I think this is really common in our culture, especially around sexuality. We think that everyone else will be grossed out, or they will be like, "Oh, I don't want to share, that's too personal," or they'll be judgmental about what you choose to share. And this is really unfortunate. They end up overestimating the risk because it turns out people do want to talk about these things, right? They're an open book, ask me anything. And I think people have a lot more comfort and ability to deal with difficult conversations, but it's not often brought up to them. Like, ask yourself this: how many times in the past week did you talk about your sex life or sex in general or sexual topics with some of your close friends? Probably not a lot, right? It's not something people bring up every day. And I think this is something that comes from, in the US, we live in a very puritanical society. We have a history of suppressing these things to the detriment of everyone's education, health, and well-being, and honestly, freedom of expression. So when people are held back, they're like self-censoring because they don't believe it will go well. They don't believe people want to talk about these difficult topics, and so they hold back. And this holds back our collective progress. As a society, as a culture, the more that we're able to talk about sexual topics, taboo topics, with grace, sensitivity, compassion, knowledge, the more we'll be able to accept others who are different from us, and the more we'll feel comfortable in our own skin, in our own sexuality, in our own preferences and desires. Because if it's something that's taboo and we're holding it back, how can we know what other people think or feel or what other people are experiencing? Because it's all kept behind our respective closed doors and it's never brought out into the light. And when you don't bring something out into the light, how can you destigmatize it? How can you remove the shame and the fear around these things and the complicated mess and web that's around these topics that I think holds us back, honestly? So people will avoid these conversations. And I have a tip to help start dismantling that. Because, you know, I'm all about destigmatizing sexuality and these sorts of topics. And the trick is go first. Be the first person who brings these things up in your circles, in your family, in your friendship groups, in your communities, and be brave to be open and transparent about what you think, what you feel, what you want to learn about, what you want to share, all these kinds of things. And I'm not saying don't have fear, because being brave is not the absence of fear. Being brave is maybe feeling some fear, but choosing to do it anyway. And when you're brave enough to share, it means that you know you're opening yourself up for scrutiny, criticism, fear, rejection, being mocked, things like that. And it takes a lot of vulnerability. You have to be okay with who you are and what you like and what you're interested in and where you stand to be able to open up like that, because other people and their reactions, while you can't control for them, can affect you to some degree. And so when you become very comfortable with yourself and you've worked through all your shame and all kinds of the weird dark places within you, like shadow work, and this is not all due to sexuality, but that's kind of the lens that I'm examining it through right now, then you come to the table a little more brave, because what can they say that can hurt you? Ask yourself that. And if they can say things that can hurt you, what can you do to prevent it from hurting? Or what can you say in rebuttal to kind of like let them know the impact they're having on you, and maybe ways that they're not being compassionate or tolerant or open-minded, because sometimes people will say things that hurt you because they themselves inside are feeling very uncomfortable, whether it's fear, anger, like a disconnect is going on inside of them, and so they project that outwards. So when you're brave enough to go first and initiate conversations that are difficult or taboo, then you set an example to the people around you, which is incredibly powerful. And it just happens in small ways, small conversations, like just admitting to something you think is maybe embarrassing, or asking a question, like starting a conversation you think people might not want to talk about. This shows that over time, you become more brave and people begin to see you leading by example, right? And the more that people do this, the more we liberate others. The more we show them, hey, it's okay to talk about this stuff. And hey, it can be done in a sensitive, compassionate, curious way, non-judgmental way. And when people see that example being shown, they're much more likely to choose to partake in it themselves, choose to be a part of it, choose to try something different and share something unusual and kind of like step out of their comfort zone a little bit. It challenges everybody to level up and do their inner work so that they can show up to these kinds of conversations with a more balanced perspective, a more open mind, a more compassionate viewpoint, less judgment. So I'm really curious, do you feel more or less fear when it comes to these situations? Do you feel more uncomfortable asking other people difficult questions or bringing up taboo topics? Or do you feel more fear when people ask you difficult questions or bring up difficult topic or, taboo topics to you? This is a really great question to ask yourself, and then ask it under all kinds of different topics. How do I feel when people bring up my personal sex life? How do I feel when people ask me about my sexual interests or my orientation or any kinds of preferences, boundaries, health, history, things like that. And so I'm interested. So let me know in the comments. And if you want to start destigmatizing this kind of thing too, feel free to share this video and use the conversation starter about not starting conversations. All right, enjoy. Talk to you all soon.